Hello guys, Counterfactual History here, and I am here with my first original alternate history scenario, which covers a Confederate victory scenario that I don't see covered very often, and that is, what if the Confederate States had won after 1864, or more specifically, what if the Confederate States had won after the 1864 presidential election in the Union? So, I'd like to begin with covering just some of the basic situation that the Confederacy was in at the time. So by 1864, the war had very decisively turned against the Confederacy. They suffered three decisive defeats in 1863 at Gettysburg, Chattanooga, and Vicksburg. And 1864 had further capitalized off of that with the Overland Campaign marching towards Richmond and hoping to cut off Lee from the Confederate capital, and with Sherman marching towards the Confederate heartland in Atlanta, Georgia. So militarily, the South was pretty much defeated by this point, but they still had hope of victory because of the 1864 presidential election, which was Abraham Lincoln's re-election campaign against Democratic challenger George B. McClellan, who had been a previous commander of the Army of the Potomac and who was a war Democrat running with a peace party. It was a weird campaign set up by McClellan, where McClellan was a war Democrat who favored continuing the war, but his vice president was a Copperhead who wanted to make peace with the South. And then his party even endorsed a peace plank in the Democrat platform for the year. So the Confederates had hoped that if McClellan was elected, there would be a type of negotiated peace with the Union. And that was their hope for the 1864 election. Now, historically, that didn't happen, and I'll cover the reasons why here shortly. But for this timeline, I'm going to cover what if that had gone differently, and what if McClellan had actually been able to win that election, and what would need to change for that to happen. And that's what I intend to cover in this video. So this timeline goes a little bit long, so I'm going to break it up into multiple videos. And what I want to cover for this video is, how does McClellan achieve victory in the 1864 election in this alternate history? So to begin, I want to cover the three reasons why I think Lincoln won historically. The first one, and you might have gotten this already, is that the Democrat platform contradicted itself. You had their presidential nominee being a war Democrat who wanted to continue the war, whereas the vice president in the party was backing a peace platform of making peace with the Confederacy, which those two things combined makes a very incoherent campaign and one that not many voters actually trusted the direction of. Second is that third-party challenger John C. Fremont dropped out of the race. And if you haven't heard of him, I don't blame you. He's kind of one of the less well-known figures, but he's actually fairly interesting. He was the first Republican nominee for president in 1856, and he himself was a radical Republican, which meant he was even more of a pro-civil rights and harsher Reconstruction than Lincoln was. Lincoln was more of a moderate Republican. Fremont was a radical Republican. And what Fremont's third party bid actually threatened to do was draw away a large portion of Lincoln's support. But whenever Fremont realized that the Democrats were a peace platform, he dropped out of the race to prevent the war vote from being split between him and Lincoln, because he thought that the war was more important than who was leading it. So Fremont dropping out helped Lincoln tremendously as well. But then the third and most major one that I see most people mention is the fall of Atlanta in 1864. So just before the election was set to take place, William Tecumseh Sherman took Atlanta, Georgia, which provided a huge morale boost to the Union. Because before the morale was very low. Because I mentioned the Overland Campaign earlier, and while it was strategically making progress, it also had a lot of casualties and a lot of battles that ended in stalemates or draws or inconclusive fighting. And combine that with all the casualties from the previous years of war, and Union morale was very, very low at the time. And the fall of Atlanta actually helped boost war morale and made the Union confident that Abraham Lincoln could win the war, which is something they were lacking early on in the election. So, in this new timeline, all three of those need to be reversed. The Democrats need a consistent platform, Fremont needs to remain in the race, and Atlanta needs to hold. So the first one I want to cover is a consistent Democrat platform and what I think it might have looked like for the year, and which one I think could have provided him the best chance of victory. And so, what I've chosen to go with is in this new timeline, the Democrats are going to fully rally behind McClellan's viewpoint. And I do that for a couple reasons. A, McClellan's viewpoint, just to cover it, was the idea of union with slavery. He was willing to constitutionally protect slavery in the South, but he wasn't going to sign a peace treaty with the Confederacy that didn't involve reunification with the Union. So he wanted to restore the Union, and his commitment to that was strong, and he wanted to continue the war to that end, but he wasn't about the abolitionist direction it had taken. And the reason why I think the Democrats, if they wanted to have won the 1864 election, should have rallied around this motto is because A, the Copperheads weren't ever going to vote for a guy like Lincoln or Fremont. The turnout might have been slightly depressed if they had gone with McClellan's idea, but it would have maintained war Democrat support. And historically, the war Democrats actually flocked to Lincoln because of the Copperhead dominance in the party platform. So if we have the party, rally around McClellan's view, I don't think the war Democrats would have really bolted the way they did historically, which provides McClellan with a very solid base of support on top of his Copperhead support. And then two is that this platform was actually just more popular than the peace platform. The Union didn't necessarily want to end the war or admit that, like admit a loss to the Confederacy. They still wanted to win the war and have a Union, but they just weren't confident in Lincoln to do it, and a lot of them weren't really on board with the abolitionist direction that the war had taken. So this also wins over a lot of independent voters. And on top of the fact I think it gets war Democrat support, independent voter support, and maintains a level of Copperhead support, I think the other thing about it that makes me want to, for this timeline, have McClellan's viewpoint be endorsed for the scenario is the fact that the peace platform nearly didn't get added. That was actually like a last minute thing to add to the peace plank. So I don't it was a last minute thing to add the peace plank to the Democrat platform, and it nearly got shot down. So I think it's realistic to assume that it could have gotten shot down. And then B, McClellan was just stubborn. You learn anything about his military career or about who he was as a person, he was incredibly stubborn and incredibly set in his mindsets. He did not like to change his mind. So I think it's better to have the Democrats rally around him than have an incoherent campaign, at least for the sake of this scenario. So that's how I think the Democrat platform could have been more consistent and more palatable to the Union at the time. The second one I want to cover is Atlanta holding out till after the election. So, historically, what ended up happening is that originally Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston was tasked with defending Atlanta, and he did a series of defensive maneuvers that kind of stalled Sherman from getting to Atlanta, and he was doing a pretty good job. But there's one factor that kind of got him replaced, and it isn't the fact that he made a military screw up, it's the fact that Confederate President Jefferson Davis, A, did not like Johnston at all, but B, Jefferson Davis thought Johnston was too defensive, and so he wanted someone who would go on the attack more. So he replaced Joseph E. Johnston with Confederate General John B. Hood, and Hood did do a offensive campaign against Sherman, and it backfired horrifically. It killed a bunch of Confederates and basically destroyed the Confederate army defending Atlanta, and it allowed Sherman to seize Atlanta. So, in this new timeline, we're just going to have Joseph E. Johnston remain in command of the Union. Whoops, wrong army. Have Joseph E. Johnston remain in command of the Confederate army, and that would mean that he would continue to take defensive stances in defending Atlanta, which would conserve Confederate forces and stall Union forces, which I think had a real potential to stall the fall of Atlanta till after the election. So, due to this, and due to an overall lack of victories without the fall of Atlanta, Union faith in Lincoln is very low. They don't trust him to win the war. And I actually think that, furthermore, this lack of faith in Lincoln to win the war would actually sway some of the soldier vote to McClellan. So, that's another key voting block that Lincoln had is the soldier vote. A lot of soldiers voted for him. but if there weren't any military victories, I think it's possible that some more soldiers would have voted for McClellan. So then that all three of those, well, all three reasons tie together in a way, but the first two that I covered, I think, really tie into this one, which is John C. Fremont not dropping out. So, if McClellan didn't endorse a peace platform, or, well, he never, fully got behind it, he was still a war Democrat, but if McClellan's party hadn't rallied around a peace platform, and Lincoln wasn't showing that he could win the war, Fremont, A, wouldn't view it as a campaign between war and peace, he'd view it as between war, and war, so he wouldn't drop out and for sake of the war, and he wouldn't have confidence in either of the other candidates to win the war, so he really has no reason to drop out in this new timeline. So he stays and stays in the race. So I think Fremont's campaign would have turned away a lot of radical Republicans away from Lincoln. And with McClellan keeping the war Democrat vote for himself and Fremont taking the radical Republican vote for himself, Lincoln's National Union ticket that he formed historically kind of just collapses in this timeline. It doesn't produce the results he needs, which I believe all three of these factors combined could lead to McClellan actually winning the 1864 presidential election. So the end result of these divergences that I've just talked about is that George B. McClellan wins the presidential election of 1864. And I've drawn up like a little electoral map of what I think that would look like. It's not probably 100% accurate to what McClellan victory would look like, but I think it's reasonable enough. So with that out of the way, that is the main divergence point for this timeline. And in the next video in the series, I'm going to cover what McClellan's handling of the Civil War looks like and how that, leads to the overall scenario as well. So if you guys enjoyed the video, like and subscribe. Hit the bell icon to be notified whenever further parts of this come out. And feel free to leave your discussions and thoughts on the scenario so far down in the comments below. And yeah, I will see you guys in the next video.